Yes, my name's Steve Trowell, and I work for the Division of Coastal Management up in the Washington Regional Office. I'm a field representative, so I'm working at the ground level in the initial permitting and then monitoring the construction activities that occur after the permit is issued. The area that I work in is up there in that Albemarle-Pamlico region, and it's an area where we have a lot of big fetches, that windborne energy that's generated over larger water bodies, and so we have fairly significant, moderate to heavy wave action, and so a lot of the living shorelines that I've been involved in incorporated an offshore seal, and most of the time that's been done with a granite riprap. And I thought I would show you a couple of good projects that were undertaken, good in the methods that were used to construct them, and some of the equipment that was used to overcome and avoid negative impacts to the adjacent uplands and wetlands. The first site was on Ocracoke Island. This is just inshore of Teach's Hole, just south or back towards the inlet from the entrance channel into Silver Lake. This site was built in early March of this year, mid-March. And I wanted to show an overview of the site first to show you where the material was stockpiled. The material was stockpiled in this area. This is an upland area here. The wetland line is somewhere about right in here. This is an existing single-family residence. This is their parking area, septic's back here. And then this is a high marsh area here, vegetated with black needle rush. You can see we have a sandy bank here. These sand areas here were from storm events over the winter. This sand is rolled over time and rolls back as it erodes back into the marsh. And these darker areas you see here is the organic peat layer that the marsh is growing on, and it's re-emerging on the opposite, the seaward side of the sand berm. Give you some background on this, a little background on this site. This was a tow revetment that was put in back in '06, and this shoreline was straight at that time. So in the last 8 years, we've had approximately about 35 feet or so feet of erosion that occurred over that time. A significant portion of that erosion occurred in one storm event, and that was Hurricane Irene. Hurricane Irene sat in the Pamlico Sound and generated a lot of wave action over a long period of time. And then for a week after that, we had a continual northeast wind, sometimes as much as gale force, and it caused a significant amount of erosion on this shoreline. Anyway, the equipment access to the site, it was done with a long reach excavator, and logging mats were used. Again, the material was staged here, and the material was moved by a rubber tire backhoe to a point on the shoreline. The long reach was used so that the equipment too didn't have to track out into the water and didn't have to track up and down the shoreline. It stayed on a mat right here. This was the first access site. There are the logging mats. This is what's called a rock box, and it has three sides, approximately 18 inches to 2 feet in height, and it's constructed out of plate steel. Rubber tire backhoe in this application was used to move the rock from the stockpile location. Separate smaller excavator was used. This excavator, you can't see it, but it had a thumb, so the rock could be picked up individually and placed in the front end bucket of that rubber tire backhoe and then moved to the rock box on the shore for placement with the long reach excavator. There's a picture showing how the rock box is accessed by the backhoe, and again the excavator. All that is perched on mats. He sat in one location and was able to. That seal was those were approximately 70 feet in length. With the bottom of the gap was 5 feet, and then the top of the gap was approximately 15 feet plus in width. And you heard some of the design of offshore seals. This was the baffle was put on the backside for the most significant reason is you see these darker areas out here is a pretty significant submerged aquatic vegetation resource. It's eelgrass. And to avoid any potential impacts to that habitat, the seal was moved back here where there wasn't any submerged aquatic vegetation present. Very little shellfish resource in the form of naturally occurring shellfish resource in the form of oysters or clams. Now, not necessarily this revetment, but there's a bulkhead in the existing riprap revetment and seaward of that bulkhead, and there's a lot of oyster attachment and recruitment to that hard substrate on the riprap, and we expect to see that occur here. But that's one of the things that was looked for during the permitting phase. This was a major CAMA permit. This is an upland area here, and the second access point was here. So he was able to construct this part of the seal and this baffle while sitting here. Then he moved the machine back, took the mats out, and laid the mats here, and sat right here and completed this as well as this.
So is that a $35,000 improvement by the homeowner?
Is that his question was that a $35,000 home improvement by the property owner? You know, I didn't inquire. I mean, that's one thing I tend to avoid because, you know, some of the things I'm talking about are somewhat trade secrets. There's one of these contractors that I talked about how he did it, and he didn't want me to go into too much detail, so I didn't get into the cost of it. Riprap, you know, when we're doing tow revetments or say, for instance, riprap installation in front of a bulkhead, I have been privy to some recent quotes from a couple of different contractors, and it was about $60 to $70 a cubic yard for the installation of it. Again, now, you know, equipment access plays into it. You know, when you've got to use mats, over time those mats are going to begin to fail, and there's a cost associated with that. And then time to move the material to the final site for placement, that kind of, all that plays into the cost of it. But as far as $35,000, I think that's probably an overestimate. You know, I think it was probably cheaper than that. Feel like it was anyway, but again, I didn't get into the exact cost of it. This picture here shows we got a man here that's guiding the placement of the rock, the initial placement, and this is a fabric that's used to provide a footing for the rock and to try to slow. There is going to be some settlement of the rock structure, and this is a method that's employed to try to lessen that impact. This is a second site. This site is on Satterwhite Creek, the lower part of Satterwhite Creek, a creek off the Pungo River. And this site, it wasn't necessarily a living shoreline installation. This is a low sediment bank here in a pine plantation. It used to be a warehouser tract that was subdivided and turned into a residential subdivision. But this is a low sediment bank here. It's about 2.5 feet. And then we've got this black needle rush marsh that had an erosion escarpment about a foot high. But a lot of the same techniques were used here that are used in living shoreline applications where we're installing granite riprap or a marl riprap. It's approximately, the work that was done here is approximately 160 to 180 feet. They armored, there's another piece of black needle rush marsh that you can't see here, but they started the shoreline stabilization measure here and carried it around this point of marsh here and then tucked it in behind another fringe of marsh that's gaining width as you move back in a landward direction. Points of access, in order to minimize the amount of upland area and vegetative buffer removal, there was a site chosen in here where there was a minimal amount of trees removed to allow equipment access to the shoreline, and then there were a few trees again that removed in the alignment or on the backside of the alignment of the revetment to allow for equipment swing and equipment access. And the driveway into the site is back here, and as you'll see in the upcoming pictures, the contractor, and this again was done in mid-March, and as we all know, we had a real wet winter and it was wet into the spring, and he used mats, and he does this on all his sites, wet or dry, to minimize the land disturbance that occurs. And what this contractor has found over time, yes, initially the upfront cost of purchasing the mats are more expensive than just driving over, wait until it's dry or conditions are dry enough to allow the equipment access without mats. But what he's found is he spends less time filling and grading and repairing areas disturbed during the installation. So in the long run, he's saving money as he installs these things. This is a photo showing the access point, a 10 cubic yard dump truck backing down the mats. These are plank mats. They're about 8 by 10. They cost somewhere in the neighborhood of about $250 to $275 a mat. And I estimate this to be the trail of mats that he's got in here. It's about 200 feet. And you can see the dump trucks back into the stockpile site. He's got a rock box there. This is where the dump truck backs to and dumps into this rock box here. This rock box is heavier. It's heavier constructed. It's built out of 1-inch plate steel. It's a heavier plate steel because it's having to withstand the force of the rock being dumped into the box. And then we've got a rubber track skid steer that's moving the rock from the stockpile location, staying on mats, down to another rock box. This rock box is built out of 3/4 inch steel and has similar dimensions, approximately, I think that was a tad bit smaller. It's 8 foot wide by 10 foot long. Back down to, and the equipment used in this project was a 320 Caterpillar excavator. There's a picture showing the mat trail that was used to get to the shoreline. And this is where they're putting it on the sediment bank. It's about a 2-hour setup time involved in getting the mats on the ground. I actually passed these guys out working one day, and they had the mats stacked on a low boy trailer being pulled by 18-wheeler. And talked to them on the phone, and they were going to set up. I got back to the office, and Whitney called me and said, "Hey, do you mind doing some best management practice on riprap installations?" I jumped back in the car and went down. The point is, these guys are quick. There's about a 2-hour setup time involved in getting these mats laid out. They laid a trail of mats all the way down, and the marsh started right here and went out on that marsh point. It took them about 2 hours to get that down, and then it took them about maybe 6 hours to get the riprap installed. So they can move pretty quickly and efficiently in getting this rock installed. Again, this is the 3/4 inch plate steel. In talking with the contractor, this heavier box is required. The size of the weight of the box needs to increase with the size of the equipment that's used to keep it from sliding on the mats. And a lot of times when the rock is coming from the quarry, can't see it real well here, but at the bottom of the box, as they get to the bottom of the material that's in there, there's going to be some fines in there. And these guys he's a well-respected contractor. And what he'll do when he gets down to the bottom where we have those fines and gravel-sized rock is a man will come over, jump out here, and actually physically place by hand the rocks into the bucket. And then they'll use the skid steer to move that off-site to prevent that stuff from getting into an area, especially a wetland area. Again, this is a non-wetland area. This is a tow revetment on a sediment bank that was about 2.5 feet, but just behind the excavator is where that marsh started. You actually see the footprint sort of shrink up on that tow revetment there in front of the marsh. And then this is the site about 3 weeks later. And as you can see, there's minimal disturbance. This is the area, you do see a little bit of gravel rock, but this is the area where the rock box was set up for the initial dumping and stockpiling. And this is the driveway out. You can't even hardly tell they were there. So really all he did was pick up and leave at that point. So once the initial installation was done, he didn't have to come back in there and regrade, seed, and straw the site. It pretty much, that didn't need to be done. And my final slide is a slide, and this was an offshore seal project, and this is something that I don't want to see as a field representative when I come on there to monitor the work being done. And the issue, this riprap material being used to construct a sill was being moved to the sill location by barge. And the problem is that there was some shallow water in here, and this equipment here, this excavator didn't have the reach to reach from an upland location to place the sill material on the barge. And so what he did was he built a platform out here to set the machine on, and then the dump trucks and the 18-wheelers that were delivering the rock to the site were physically dumping the stockpile in the water. And anyway, we had to get it stopped. We did, and the whole problem was solved when once this was removed. They rented a long-reach excavator and sat here, and were able to reach and place the riprap material on the barge from an upland stockpile site.
Is that Ocracoke?
Yes, sir. He asked, was that Ocracoke? And yes, it was. This was a subcontractor to the main contractor that had the contractor to restore the old Coast Guard building. And we always have a pre-construction meeting prior to the start of a project. And for some reason or another, the subcontractor couldn't make it that day. And so we met with the primary contractor, and I guess there was a communication problem as to how it was to be done. But anyway, that's the end of my presentation, short and sweet. If you got any questions, I'll take those at this time.
That first scene that you showed us, it was a sort of a pot mark. Was that common along the entire, there, right there, was that common along the entire shore? Or was that just one washout? I didn't understand.
No, it was common along the entire shore. That whole shoreline took a beating during Irene. And the dramatic loss was pretty much the same. I mean, it was in the neighborhood of 12 to 25 feet of land loss there. It wasn't just this one location, the whole shoreline retreated.
And how deep would the water have been there? Several feet, perhaps?
No, sir. That's a good question. Actually, it's only about a foot deep here in this location. And it gradually deepens, but not very much. Again, this submerged aquatic vegetation you see there, it's only about maybe 18 inches, if that. It's a long, shallow shoal. Then it drops off to Teach's Hole, that navigation channel offshore. But, it's, I'm not sure the exact distance, but it's more than 100 feet, couple of 100, 200, 300 feet to the edge of the channel. So, but one thing you got to consider is, again, we're not in a lunar tide situation, we're in a wind tide situation, and northwest winds, northeast or northerly winds will pile the water up down the sound. And what happened during the hurricane is we get some high water here. The water was higher on the eastern side of the sound, but then we had a bunch of northeast wind after that too, and the tide came up. So the water depths were deep because of those high wind tides, and that exasperated the situation.
And do you expect to have vegetation growing behind
Oh yes, sir. Well, I think what you'll see, it's the root mat is there, and where that marsh substrate is re-emerging on the other side of this little sand overwash berm. And so it's going to grow in there and pine in there on its own naturally. We saw the same thing in this area. Again, we're coming out of a winter. Marsh dies back in the winter. And when it does, it tends to break off either by wind or wave action. And you may not know it's even there, but the root system is just under the surface of that sand, and it'll reemerge. Last summer, this whole point right here was alternate, the smooth cordgrass marsh. And I think that's what you're going to see. You're going to get that wave action off this beach. And you're going to see that alternate floor marsh pioneer in there. Yes, sir.
Why didn't they attach to the existing structures and make it shore parallel rather than put it at an angle?
Attached to this structure here. Look, one, again, I mean, that's SAV in here too. So the structure was, as a result of these habitats that are out here, this area had fairly, again, this picture is taken in March. You'll see more of it now, even now, as that SAV begins to do its thing this time of year and grow. And so the alignment was pushed back here in order to avoid that important habitat here. But that's a very good question. That's why this baffle too was located on the backside. Again, we're just trying to avoid the SAV that was present. SAV, again, I hate to use acronyms, but that's submerged aquatic vegetation. It's a valuable fisheries habitat.
Along the outside of the riprap that you put down, where the SAV started growing, did you consider kick-starting that with oyster seed, or is there a particular reason that you didn't do that, or it just didn't come up?
Kickstart the revetment with oyster seed.
Yeah.
Necessarily did not come up. It would certainly speed that recruitment process up. I think what you'll see is there's some pretty good currents that's fairly near the inlet, and what we've seen on other past revetments, the oyster recruitment there happens pretty quickly. But it doesn't seem to survive. What you'll see is a lot of small oysters probably don't live more than about maybe 12 months, 16 months after they recruit to it, and because it's not being exposed, it does fall or subject to the boring sponge and other things of that nature. There'll be some oyster recruitment to that, but you won't see a lot of them, at least that's been my observation, survive, the market size.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Steve?
All right, thank you.